tonight's topic is where do we go from here? The war on terrorism and its impact upon America's approach to the world. And as you all know, our guest is Professor Anthony Lake. He's known in a way to all of you. But let me just do what is required and make a few comments about the chronology of his most impressive career. Briefly, graduate of Harvard, magna cum laude, 1961, joined the State Department in 1962. Among his service were postings in Vietnam as vice consul in Saigon, and then again in Hue, where he worked, I know, with one of our senior members, David Ness. He served as the special assistant to the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, Dr. Kissinger, 1969 to 1970, but also with other good people like Bob Osgood, with whom I know he was close. He received his PhD degree from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. He served or worked in the Muskie campaign. He was at the Carnegie Institution. He did work also as a professor at the 5 colleges consortium. It's not a consortium, 5 college professor, Amherst and Mount Holyoke. And in 1991 and 1992, he served as a special advisor on foreign policy to the Clinton-Gore campaign. Now, I've skipped one major thing which I shouldn't have left out, and that, of course, he was the director of the policy planning staff at the State Department under President Carter, and it was a couple of months after leaving that post that he spoke here in Baltimore to the Council in the spring of 1981, which for many was memorable. It was a small group of trustees and corporate members in an off-the-record address, as I recall. After President Clinton's election, of course, he was appointed as the President's National Security Advisor. I believe that it's fair to say that he's the major architect of the Clinton foreign policy. More recently, he's been at Georgetown as a distinguished professor in the school of the Edmund A. Walsh School of Diplomacy. I should note that he's the vice chairman of UNICEF USA. Let me note quickly, he's published a number of books, all of which are interesting, several of which deal with the theme of looking ahead at American foreign policy. His most recent work is entitled 6 Nightmares. It was written it was published in 2000. Among the nightmares, and there are a number of them in it, but among them were, of course, the question of terrorism. And I think it's very interesting that the difficulty of uprooting terrorists, the difficulty of identifying them, the need for international cooperation in nearly all the phases of the operation that we looked at were identified by Professor Lake at that time. And if I may, just one short quote. If such an attack occurs, and he was speaking of weapons of mass destruction on our soil within the next 5 years, we must be able to say, looking backwards at that period, that we did everything we could to prevent it. Now, of course, it's one thing to see an intellectual imperative, and it's another one to act upon it. But the message is certainly clear today that that particular problem, which was among those he identified, needs profound and urgent action. It's a great pleasure to present to you one of the very serious students of American foreign policy and one of our distinguished practitioners, Dr. Anthony Lake.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you all for being here. That's a very nice way of saying I've always had trouble holding down a job over the years. And actually, the main thing you left out was that I was a farmer for 12 years while I was teaching, which in some ways, at least in the way it smelled sometimes, preparation for my return to the federal government, some of the problems. I first want to apologize for having missed the reception. The bad news for me was that I didn't get a chance to have a drink and meet many of you. The good news for you was that I think I'm coming down with the flu, and therefore I didn't shake any hands and violate the Biological Weapons Convention but we will proceed to talk about the future again in somewhat a different way than I have been for the past few years, giving a fair number of speeches on the basis of the book, Six Nightmares. I should mention I am not here to sell the book. That's Six Nightmares. As my, it's because I don't feel right doing that, although by my calculation there are 19 shopping days till Christmas, and it's got a nice red cover that would, but I'm not. In those speeches, I've been trying to scare people and talk about the really very dangerous combination of a new form of terrorism that I'll speak briefly about in a little while, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I fear that we still have not seen the worst that is to come. And what you said, Frank, is absolutely right. And I hope that the terrible event of September 11th is a real wake-up call for the country, and that we will not now relax since, but into the future now continue to make all the preparations that we can. But I want to step back, and it's perhaps a little less exciting. We can talk about the terrorism and the various forms of weapons of mass destruction and what could happen in the discussion if you want, and talk about where we're going now in Afghanistan and beyond, both in the short term and in the long term. I do this with some trepidation because I remember the words of a great American philosopher named Samuel Goldwyn of Hollywood, California, who once said, "Only an idiot would make predictions, especially about the future." But I think I can at least try to identify some of the questions that are before us, some of the issues that are going to have to be decided, because they are all issues, I think, that need to be debated by a free society as we go forward into a very difficult future. And it is going to be, I think, a future that stretches out before us. And one of the things I want to talk about is why I believe, indeed I am convinced, that the war on terrorism is going to be a long, drawn-out affair. It's simply going to be a part of our lives now, well into the future. What I say will seem to some of you perhaps to be pessimistic, and I don't mean to be. In fact, I am not a pessimist. I'm not a pessimist for two reasons. One is that historically, in fact, terrorists have never won. They never have. And they've had an effect. They have exacted a terrible cost, but they have never won. And the second reason I am an optimist is that I am a Red Sox fan. And you have to be an optimist if you're a Red Sox fan. I make no judgments at all about what my Oriole friends are going through now also. So let me talk about first just about some of the short-term challenges that are before us. Certainly in the last few days now, we have seen some very good news indeed. The Taliban is on the run. Clearly Osama bin Laden's ability to operate is constrained, but only to some degree, because his pattern of operation has always been to put in place cells that had an extraordinarily large degree then of autonomy. And we don't know what they are up to now. So again, we shouldn't assume that if we get him, it's all over. But other good news is that the Pashtun tribes people now are fighting among themselves in a way they weren't before, when it was unclear in which direction military events would go. As I said, all in all, good news. And all of the commentators who just a week ago were saying that the Bush administration was idiotic and incompetent, I can remember those words well from my own experiences, are now saying that they're geniuses. In fact, I think they're closer to the latter than the former, and have conducted this all very well indeed. But there are some very difficult short-term questions, short-term. One of them, of course, as you've been reading, is who will rule now in Kabul. I think the answer will be that we will see after it's sorted out, a rather nominal government in Kabul with a high degree of autonomy in the various tribal areas. The question is whether this will then lead to a kind of, or a new outbreak of civil war, which would be tragic and not at all in our interests. That will be decided largely by the nature of that nominal government and whether there is power sharing. The administration was quite right in trying to hold the Northern Alliance back until the international community could get its political ducks in a row before they entered Kabul. Understandably, the Northern Alliance wasn't going to wait. They were the ones who had done the dying and the fighting, and they wanted to make sure that they got their share by going into Kabul. But there are two other very specific reasons we should be aware of, I think, as to why it is important that there be a broad-based government, or at least that possibility. The first is that it is very important that the Pashtuns and others in the South believe that they can get a fair share of political power so that they will come over and fight on our side. To the degree that they do so, to that degree the possibility is lessened that we will have to do such fighting ourselves. But the second, and I think even bigger reason for this, is that we are seeing rather ominously within Pakistan criticism of President Musharraf, saying, wait a minute, you have cast our lot with the Americans, a courageous decision that he made, and now we see the Northern Alliance, who are much closer to India than to us, taking Kabul, and you have made a fundamental error, because in the long run, we could end up, we Pakistanis, with an India on one side and an Afghanistan, allied more or less with India on the other, and this could shake Musharraf's position within Pakistan. And the great wild card in this is, I believe, not Afghanistan's future, but Pakistan's future. Imagine for a moment an extremist government coming into power in Pakistan, and you would have, in effect, a Taliban-like government, but with nuclear weapons. And that really should concentrate our minds. So there's a great deal at stake in the success, and they've been doing very well in the last few days, of the US and the UN and others in putting together a broader-based government. Second big short-term question is, how do you maintain order in the meantime? I think it is unlikely that there will be a UN peacekeeping mission. It's hard for the UN to move that quickly, but there will be, I hope, some form of multinational force supported by the UN and us and others. And then the third big question for this winter, and one I want to harangue you about for a moment, is how to get through the humanitarian crisis that looms ahead. And here I want to make a short appeal for UNICEF. There are, every year, about 300,000 Afghan children who die of preventable causes. UNICEF now estimates that another 100,000 could die this winter if aid doesn't get to them. Those are numbers, I know, 300,000, 100,000, et cetera, but every one of those hundreds of thousands is a young human being. And those young human beings are already suffering very badly. Half of Afghan children are malnourished. And this is probably this side of, or that side of Sierra Leone, the most traumatized group of young people in the world. A poll that UNICEF did in 1997 of young people in Kabul showed that 90% of them believed that they would die in fighting. And you can imagine with that psychological scar tissue, how they're going to grow up and how this violence could then replicate itself in the future. So don't buy my book. Don't tell my publisher I said that. Give to UNICEF instead. The medium-term choices may be even more difficult than the short term. First of all, of course, if the Taliban and al-Qaeda don't collapse completely and we face a guerrilla war, which could happen, I don't think it will, but there could be an extended guerrilla war in the country, then there will be a very difficult decision about who fights it and the degree of our own military participation in it beyond the special forces we've been sending in. And a second, and I think even more difficult decision that could well be made reasonably shortly and needs debate is, where do we go after Afghanistan? The goals of the administration in the war on terrorism have, I think, very usefully shifted. It began with, as you recall, in the first days, we are going to defeat all evil, which is more of a theological question, I think, than a foreign policy one, and I can't address here. It went then to, we are going to destroy all governments that harbor terrorists. Since there are 50 or 60 al-Qaeda networks around the world, that would be a significant undertaking. Then it became, we will destroy terrorism, also beyond our capacity, and then, and our interest perhaps, in the sense that a number of terrorist groups are purely local and don't affect our interests that much, although any terrorism anywhere should be stamped out if possible. And it now has usefully become, as I understand it, that we are going after any terrorist organization, quote, with global reach. Now, the problem is that if you look at, in my view, the government that outside of Afghanistan still is doing more to support terrorism with global reach, i.e. Hezbollah, et cetera, it is Iran. Yet in Washington, there is a growing chorus of voices within and outside the government that is suggesting that we got that 3/4 right, the I, the R, and the A, but that it is Iraq we should go after. Saddam Hussein certainly deserves going after in various ways. We can discuss it later. And the problem with Iran is it would be more difficult militarily to go after, that it is the second most democratic country, ironically, in the Middle East, even if the democratic leaders are not allowed to exercise power over foreign policy decisions. And it is a member, at least partially, of the coalition. Yet Iran does support Hezbollah, is a leading exporter of terrorism, is vehemently opposed to the Middle East, any Middle East peace process, and is still working hard to acquire weapons of mass destruction. So this will not be an easy discussion, and again, an easy decision, and again deserves discussion, I think. Or do we focus now on Sudan or Somalia? Perhaps Syria, others that have been involved in terrorism, and there are, I think we will be reading more and more about this, some very difficult decisions on how we help countries like Indonesia and the Philippines who have unhappily terrorist groups, even training camps within them. So those are all difficult, but I want to talk about what is, I think, even more difficult, or at least more important, and that is the longer term of where this war is taking us. I believe that this period could very well be just as important to the future of American foreign policy as the late 1940s and early 1950s were at the beginning of the Cold War. The decisions, I think, that we make now as we put together coalitions in fighting terrorism could prove just as sticky as the decisions that we were making, again, in the late 40s and early 50s. What's the logic of this? Well, it comes in three propositions. The first is that we cannot pursue the war on terrorism without such coalitions. The second proposition is that this is going to be, as I said, a very long-term work, the war on terrorism, and should be. And third, therefore, that the bargains we make with other coalition members are likely to extend well into the future, just as in the Cold War we made bargains not just with allies like those in NATO, but with people, thugs, avaricious thugs, like Mobutu. So first, why do we need coalitions? Well, I think it's almost obvious. There are, just with Al-Qaeda, 50 or 60 networks that need to be rolled up around the world. We have neither the resources nor the skills to do so ourselves, and therefore we have to rely on cooperation with other governments to get the job done. Not to mention the necessity of having cooperation with other governments if we are going to insist, as we should, on a policy of no sanctuary for terrorists anywhere. So second, why is this a long-term proposition? And here I want to take a little longer on it. It goes not just the answer to the time it's going to take to roll up these various networks, but to see why this is the case, we have to understand to some degree the motivation of the terrorists. And we need to, as you do not often read, make distinctions, I believe, between the leaders of terrorism, like Osama bin Laden, and its followers. And if you look at this motivation, you'll see why what I would call modern or existential terrorists have a particular attraction for weapons of mass destruction, which makes them so difficult. The leaders of terrorism, including both, again, the leaders of Al-Qaeda, but also many of the terrorists who act alone, are different from the kinds of terrorists we saw 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, groups like the IRA or the PLO or others, even Hezbollah to some degree today, were motivated by political goals. They were trying to reach political goals. Therefore, they would take responsibility for their actions because they wanted publicity. And they were, to some degree, self-deterred because they knew if the actions that they took were heinous enough that it could create a political backlash against their goals. So they tended to be somewhat self-deterred and precise and reasonably well organized. Today's terrorists, whether it's Osama bin Laden, largely, people can argue about his motives, but largely, or whoever it is who is sending anthrax through the mails, or Timothy McVeigh or the others, are motivated not so much by political goals as simply by hatred. Simply by hatred, a desire to lash out against a global culture that they don't like, lash out against the West, lash out against here internally, against the U.S. government that they believe is taking away their liberties, etc. Lash out against people of other religions. Lash out at any them that they can see on whom they can place the blame for their own personal deficiencies. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, wrote in his diary, "I act merely from my desire for revenge. I believe in nothing." I might note that Ted Kaczynski was a year behind me in college. I don't remember him. More importantly, he didn't remember me. To some degree, then, the self-flagellating Americans who say, we have brought this on ourselves, September 11th and the terrorism, it is our fault, we are to blame, are right. We are to blame. We did bring it on ourselves. But it is not for the reasons that they suggest. It is not because of what we do, it is because of who we are. It is because of our prosperity. It is because of the way we organize our society. It is because of our freedoms. It is because of our values that we are hated in this way by these reactionary terrorists, and that is not going to change. So we have to understand, again, about the leaders of terrorism, one, that this is a long-term process. It is, I believe, a fight to the finish, because they are not deterrable. You cannot bargain with them. They are acting out of an existential desire simply to lash back and to kill. And that is also why they are, I believe, attracted to weapons of mass destruction in very dangerous ways. They are particularly worried about us because, again, of the ways in which we appeal to their potential followers. It is not an accident, as Bernard Lewis, a great Arab scholar, once pointed out to me, that they have called us from time to time the Great Satan. Ask yourself who Satan was. Satan was not a warrior. Satan, I believe, if I remember my Bible correctly, Satan, in fact, lost the only battle he ever fought. Satan's power in the world, like ours, for all our blemishes, his power in the world is that of a tempter. And it is the temptations of our life that these people find so threatening, and threatening to their potential followers. Now, who are following the terrorists? Who are bin Laden's followers? I believe that largely his followers are people who, especially in the Middle East, who are frustrated, who are reacting against a better life that they can see in other areas, who are presumably poor, not like the people who hit the World Trade Center, who were more leaders, but who are poor and who are frustrated because living in an area with the most closed political culture in the world, they don't find political channels through which to express their frustrations, as Tom Friedman in a series of great columns has been pointing out, and therefore they turn to religion and the teachings of local religious leaders. And this becomes then a very combustible mixture of religion and politics. It is why bin Laden, I think very cynically, uses the Arab-Israeli dispute as a way then of broadening his appeal. With the leaders, as I said, the opposition to us comes because of who we are. With the followers, it is more, and this is the good news, about what we can do. And that is why, if we can attack poverty, et cetera, there are things that perhaps can be done about drying up the appeal of such leaders. But again, that is going to take a very long time. So both with the leaders and with the followers, I think we are in for a considerable period of dangers. Now, since the war is going to go on for a long time, the question is then the nature of the bargains that we will make to hold the coalitions together. And I think we can do this two ways. One, we can make the bargains and then add them up in 2 years and call it a strategy, which is the way the government usually works, and I don't accept any administration, I regret to say, despite one's best efforts. And the other way we can do it is to have some sort of sense of strategy as we make the bargains, and try to see the bargains in terms not only of their effect on American foreign policy generally, but as to whether strategically they will help us in this war on terrorism. The bargains are already being struck, and most of them, I think, for the most part, aren't bad. But they are being struck. We've made a little noted security commitment to Uzbekistan. We have lifted the sanctions imposed on India and Pakistan after their nuclear tests, etc. But for the most part, they haven't been bad bargains. We haven't given too much away, and we don't need to. Because the fact is that most of these governments have at least as much of an interest in fighting terrorism as we do. The fact is that 80 nations suffered casualties at the World Trade Center, and 12 nations lost more than 70 citizens each, including Pakistan, India, and Russia. We were not alone in this. And of course, terrorism is very threatening to them at home. Some of the bargains we're striking, I think, are useful ones. Debt rescheduling for Pakistan, our, as Secretary Powell said yesterday, our greater involvement in the Middle East peace process, etc. But I would argue with you that we should resist strongly some other ones, and lest we undercut the war against terrorism itself. Let me make the point in a series of questions. In the short run, if we back off our commitment to human rights, for example, with Uzbekistan, where thousands of probably nonviolent Muslims are being held political prisoner, are we really helping to dry up the sources of terrorism in the future? Similarly, if we now pull back on all the sanctions that we have against Sudan, where the government still supports slavery, in fact, in the south, are we going to reduce the possibilities of terrorism in the future? I don't think so. I think there are other ways to work with such governments. If we're nearly mute, as we have tended to be with friendly governments like that in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, who are, if not encouraging, and I think they do in some ways, at least allowing state-run presses and schools to preach literally hatred of the United States. Al-Arham, the Egyptian newspaper, very close ties to the government, saying that the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th was a plot by Israel, for example, or the teaching of hatred of the United States in the West in schools in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Persian Gulf. It may make it easier to work with such governments, but I doubt very much it is going to help us head off another generation of terrorism down the road. If in that region we never use the D word, democracy, and encourage, I'm not saying force or do it too quickly and destabilize, but if we don't talk about democracy and encouraging the opening up of these societies in that region, then the same problems that are helping to breed terrorism now will, I think, be replicated in the future. If we politicize our aid, handing it out simply as goodies to governments that are cooperating with us, rather than devoting it to where it can really make a difference in fighting poverty in Africa, which is another, I think, very strong potential breeding ground for terrorism, as we are seeing already in Somalia and other places. If we don't devote it to attacking poverty in the long run, are we really using it to best effect in fighting terrorism? And certainly, if in any way we back off our efforts to stop the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, I would ask, are we helping to reduce the dangers of terrorism? Evidently not. In short, if we are in this for the long haul, as I believe we are, then we need to think strategically, and we have to attack the fundamental causes of the problem and not be lured into making easy bargains for the sake of short-term help in our coalitions. A final note, and that is, where do we go from here at home? There's a lot to be done, a huge amount to be done here at home, both to try to deter terrorism and to deal unhappily with its consequences, because I believe there will be more, and I'll be glad to discuss this. For example, just one fact, at least until September 11th, and since then it's gotten a little better, only 5% on average of the containers and vehicles coming into the United States are ever inspected. That means you could, if you wanted to ship a small nuclear device, and they're not very large, into the United States, to ship it in, your chances are 19 out of 20 of getting it through. This is unacceptable. We can discuss that more. There's also no question that we are and must be changing our laws and the manner of our law enforcement to deal better with terrorism here in the United States. But I hope as we do, we will be debating it every step of the way, each and every measure. Don't let them just go through. First of all, because we should remember that in a war, if you lose sight of who you are and what you're fighting for, you have lost the war. And secondly, because unlike the precedents that we have, for example, for military tribunals in the World War II and to deal with the assassins of Abraham Lincoln, every change we make now, because this is a long-term war, could again be sticky and be with us for a long time. The measures taken in World War II or in the Civil War were, by definition, of a much shorter duration. So I think we have to be careful of taking the measures for the sake of our safety that could reduce our freedoms well into the future. I went slightly longer than I wanted to, but I can't resist now, not speaking from notes, but reading you a full speech, which I will do. Sorry, don't look too upset, Frank. It's a speech given by Winston Churchill that I usually used to keep on my desk after a friend gave it to me. And the words struck me recently because they apply in three ways. They apply certainly to our war against terrorism abroad. But they apply also, I believe, to our temptations to give up our freedoms in ways that we might not need to. And again, let me say that we need to give up some now. And they also apply, I believe, to our personal lives. I've had a number of people say to me after September 11th, my God, I'm not going to fly again. Maybe this has some resonance for some of you. Or I don't open my mail anymore, or I'm taking Cipro, or some of them have said I'm going to move away from Washington or other places that might be targets. And I tell them that that's crazy, both because if you do any of those things, the terrorists have won, and also because any one of us, if we wanted to be in harm's way and be present at a terrorist incident, would have a huge difficulty in guessing right and being there. So you could be radically changing the nature of how you live, or taking drugs that not only will do you no good, but probably will hurt you, for the sake of changing the odds from 1 in 20 million to 1 in 40 million. And that's not rational. Don't drive, don't smoke. It makes a lot more sense. Anyway, on all three fronts then, I will read you in toto the speech that Winston Churchill gave to the Harrow School in 1941. It went as follows: never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never. In nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. And I don't think you will, and I hope we don't. And thank you very much. Thank you. Before Frank gets to the discussion period. In fact, one comment, one request. The comment is, you have no idea how lucky you are I spared you from my famous Winston Churchill impersonation. It really doesn't work for somebody with my, who is charismatically challenged. The request is that, I'm sure you were about to say now there will be questions and answers. These really are open questions, and so I hope that this will be comments as well as questions. And I would ask that you not try to disguise comments as questions, such as, you're really wrong about such and such, aren't you? Just, let's have it.
The floor is open for questions. I'll repeat the question if it's asked from the audience as opposed to from a microphone. I think you were first, sir.
Secretary Powell outlined a plan for settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli situation that's been going on for 50 years. He even established a framework and an organization to accomplish this by appointing 2 very prominent Americans to get this done. He seemed quite forceful about it. If it's successful, how much of that, of the Arab terrorism would be eliminated, the motivation for the Arab terrorism?
When you say Middle East peace process and success, I'm saying to myself, the Boston Red Sox are going to win the World Series next year. Because I'm afraid the chances are somewhat similar, and I am not optimistic here. I thought that Secretary Powell's speech was a very good one. I think we should be very happy that the United States has gotten more involved again. Because it has been almost a conventional wisdom, and like so much conventional wisdom, right, that if in the Middle East you don't have some kind of process going on, then you pay a price. And so we need that process. In his speech, he really didn't, there were no departures from past statements. There were no surprises or new substantive initiatives. But again, saying that the United States is involved has been welcomed, and rightly so, by both the Israelis and the Palestinians. So that's all good news. Will it lead to an agreement? Frankly, I don't think so. Not in the next year or two or more. And the reason is, and we could go on and on about this, but I think the essential reason is that on the one hand, Chairman Arafat has shown himself, and did in the summer of 2000, when presented with a deal that made my jaw drop, that the Israeli Prime Minister put on the table at Camp David, and which he might or might not have been able to sell in Israel. I think probably could have, the polls showed, if he could have brought along the Knesset. And Arafat didn't see his way to accepting that. And if he couldn't accept that, under those circumstances, now, given all the increased bitterness on the Palestinian side, then I think it's very unlikely he is going to be able to, or willing to, or will accept anything in the near future. And on the other side, even the peace movement in Israel has been traumatized by a growing feeling that there's no partner to work with. And therefore, they have lost a lot of the political traction in Israel. I think one thing is Dennis Ross, who did a great job in working on this all those years, is right when he points out that a mistake that the Clinton administration made, that all of us did, was that while I think we did a good job of working on the diplomatic side, we did a lousy job of really pushing to see to economic progress among the Palestinians. And therefore, if you were a Palestinian, while the Oslo process was going on, you didn't see any benefits in your personal life of a peace process, so why should you now be rewarding Arafat if he were to make some kind of concessions? So the psychological damage on both sides is very bad. The political basis, I think, is very weak on each side for making peace in the short term. The news story of 10 days ago or so that showed that Hamas is in student council elections doing better and better against the Palestinian Authority is not going to encourage Arafat to take any more risks for peace than he ever has. So I would not be encouraged about that. At the same time, it is important that we have a process, because while I don't think that the terrorist leaders, as I was saying, are going to be very influenced by this issue. They are acting out of different motives. Bin Laden may talk about Israel, but his concerns are the Saudis, the American presence there, who we are, et cetera, as I was saying. It does make a difference to the followers. And our involvement in the peace process will help to some degree to deaden his appeal, or those who will follow him. So it's good news, process, yes. I'll be stunned if there is a settlement anytime soon, and I will be stunned if the Red Sox win the World Series. And to show you how deeply committed I am to the Middle East peace process, I actually would prefer a settlement in the Middle East to the Red Sox winning the World Series, and there aren't many things I would say that about.
The question was, to state it more simply than it warrants, is the massive population growth within the Middle East, combined with dreadful poverty and the seeming inability of the nations of the area to do much about it, a recipe for perpetual terrorism?
Again, it depends partly on whether there are terrorist leaders who are playing on that. But I think, unhappily, the answer is yes. But I wouldn't limit it. It's a particular problem in the Middle East, as I said, because that region has the least open political institutions and cultures of political cultures of any area of the world, which helps to explain partly why, when you talk about the so-called digital divide between the electronically enfranchised and those who are not, the Middle East is lagging far behind where its educational attainments over the centuries ought to have it. There's no excuse for it. But it's not just, so it's going to go on in the Middle East, and the answer, as I was suggesting, is that we have to resist the temptations for the sake of coalition building of giving them a pass on human rights and democracy and economic development, all those things, but keep urging it, because that is a big-time strategic question. I don't think those countries will fall apart, though, for the most part, but partly because the very strength of Islam and that culture. It's not an accident that this is the only region where communism never made any inroads. The strength of that culture is so overpowering that I don't think those countries will fall apart. What worries me greatly, and this is something to keep an eye on, is what happens in Pakistan, what happens in Indonesia, where we have a very large strategic stake and the largest Muslim country in the world, and where there are growing fissures. That could fall apart. That could be the place that we know all the provincial capitals in a couple of years, as we've been learning about Afghanistan. And Nigeria, and much of Africa, where the same demographic pressures are taking place, where a virulent form of Islam is spreading, unlike the traditional broader kind of Islam that with which we should have no problem, and where, as in Somalia and in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and other places, you can see, for example, as the Washington Post was reporting, a pattern of the sale of illegal diamonds, which were going through thugs like Charles Taylor in Liberia, to Gaddafi and to Al-Qaeda and other places, and helping to pay for the terrorism. So again, this is not just a Middle Eastern problem, it is a global problem, and I believe passionately that the spread of democracy and our efforts against poverty, et cetera, are the only long-term solution in drying up the appeal of simple haters, no matter how talented they may be, like bin Laden.
What do you consider a terrorist? Because I have a feeling that this war on terrorism may be used by certain countries, part of our coalition, where the leaders are dictatorial, to hold down groups that might want to try to create a more democratic government. For example, we have the Chechens are now terrorists as far as we are concerned, as far as Russia is concerned. And whereas before we were very concerned about the Chechens. There are Saudi Arabia and Egypt, other countries, part of our coalition. Will they use this war on terrorism to hold down true reforms to their government?
I'm not sure that I would lump the Chechens with some of these other more democratic groups, since I don't think they're notably democratic, and they have had some ties to Al-Qaeda, et cetera. We can argue about that. Certainly, much of what the Russians have done in Chechnya was appalling, and you're absolutely right that our statements now about Chechnya have shifted greatly in the last month and a half. But as a general point, you're absolutely right. I would define terrorism as partly through its goals, and any group that simply is lashing out of hatred and not working towards political progress, as you were suggesting, tends to be terrorist in its goals, but it's even more in terms of means. And the cold-blooded murder of innocent civilians for a political purpose is terrorism, period, and should be opposed everywhere. And much as I admire Nelson Mandela, his statement a couple of days ago of, well, you have to understand that, and I've heard him say this about Gaddafi, who had stood with him earlier, so maybe he's being nice to him in response, that after all, Nelson Mandela, had been called a terrorist. I'm not sure about that, the accuracy of that charge, but then once a terrorist, so-called terrorist, takes power, turns out that he's a statesman and everything is okay. In my view, again, murdering innocent civilians, as in Pan Am 103, for example, whatever the political purposes, is terrorism and should be both opposed and punished.
Would you discuss a theme that's very large in your book, actually, the policy coordination among the various pieces of government?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me be very, very brief about it if I can, because it's a huge subject. On the one hand, you don't want to see too much coordination in the sense that you do want debate. I was always worried when in Principals Committee meetings we all agreed when we came into the room on a difficult issue, because then you're not really exploring the issue, and we need to debate all these things, including within the government. But at the same time, there is a huge problem, as I do argue in the book, in the kind of balkanization of our government on these issues. The terrorists and the transnational criminals and others are increasingly working together in ways our government is not. Let me just give you an example. When an airplane goes down, as in the TWA, what was it, 800 or before, if you're in the White House, so you don't know which bureaucratic box to turn to, because if it is a criminal act, then it goes to the Justice Department. If it's a international terrorist act, it goes to the CIA or whoever. If it's an accident, it goes to the NSTB, et cetera, the Department of Transportation. You don't know. And you probably increasingly, as acts of terrorism are anonymous, you don't know where to go first. I think we need to pull it together in a way it never has been pulled together before. There is only one place that can pull it together, and that's the White House. No agency is going to give its bureaucratic power to any other agency. It's just a figment, and it's always been a figment of every president's imagination that he could turn it over to this agency and tell the other agencies to follow it. Only the White House can do that. And I have a radical proposal, which goes beyond even what many have said that Governor Ridge should have. Many argue that he shouldn't be simply a coordinator, and I agree with them, but he's got to have muscle, and if you're going to have muscle, then you've got to be able to preside over the budgets of those pieces of the various agencies that are working on homeland defense. I think that's step one. But I would go farther and suggest that a real problem we are going to face in the war on terrorism is what happens on the ground when there is a terrible event. Right now, at the scene, you have local, state, federal agencies all involved, and under a directive that I proposed to President Clinton and he signed, and which in retrospect I think was wrong, among federal, it seemed like a good idea at the time, among federal agencies, the FBI is in charge, even though its interest is in crime scene and FEMA's interest is in the victims, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the Homeland Defense czar, or whatever you call him, should not only have authorities over budgets, but he should have under him a cadre of people who can go immediately, who are trained in this, who can go immediately to the scene, take over, and coordinate the actions at that site.
My question is, given that we are such a diverse country, is there any way that we can safely, and specifically the intelligence community, can safely capitalize better on that diversity to achieve the kind of human intelligence that everyone was talking about immediately after the events on the 11th of September?
Of course it can, and can do more. I'm very heartened by the huge surge, and I think it's not just from the economy, although partly that, the huge surge in applications to work in the State Department, the CIA, et cetera, et cetera. The greatest, George Tenet says this all the time, privately and I think publicly also, the greatest need in the CIA and its most important contribution is not what you see in the movies, operatives skulking about on dimly lit streets stealing secrets. That's important. Much the greater need are analysts who can help connect the dots, as I was talking about before. And that means drawing on our wonderful diversity, people who understand those countries. But also it's a huge challenge to our universities. Compared to 20 years ago when there were all kinds of programs supporting the teaching of foreign languages, et cetera, now in our universities there's a movement away from that generally, so that, for example, I believe I read that there is one university in the country that teaches the languages that are spoken in Afghanistan. And we need to do something about that. But let's just hear the echoes of what you said in your statement. Thank you.